Our next speaker is Dr. Sandy Venneman from UHD. She received her PhD and MS from St. Louis University in experimental psychology. She has a postdoctorate at the Neuropsychiatric Institute at UCLA, and she holds a Missouri Lifetime Teaching Certificate. So, please come up, Sandy.
Okay, I'll be honest, this freaks me out. The last time I was on a stage like this, I was giving a presentation for a research award, and I left the stage with a microphone attached to me. All right, well, my background is, again, in biology and psychology, and I was asked to talk about cooperation, and I said, really? It's a lot easier to talk about competition rather than cooperation. So at some points I will probably degenerate into competition even though I'm trying to talk about cooperation. All right, so I'm a horse person. You'll figure that out. There's going to be more than one picture of a horse. Ooh, bird. All right, so what is cooperation? Well, cooperation refers to an outcome in which two or more interacting individuals benefit from their joint actions despite some cost they may incur from engaging in that action. So there has to be a benefit and there has to be a cost in terms of cooperation. And so an example that I got, of course, because I have horse pictures, is a picture of a team of horses. I've driven teams of horses, and in this case they are cooperating and they're both pulling against the traces, which allow them to pull whatever is behind them. But if you work with horses very much, you'll also find out that there are some cheaters, and you'll get a horse that works in tandem with another one, and it doesn't pull on the harness, and it lets the other horse do all the work. So we're going to talk a little bit about cheaters in terms of cooperation today, too. So an interesting thing is you mentioned bats. Bats do cooperative activities sometimes, and blood-sucking bats, that they get their nourishment from blood of other animals, they can only live for a short period of time if they haven't fed. So if they haven't had anything to suck the blood out of, I want to suck your blood, then they're not going to survive. So in those colonies of bats, they will actually, the bats that have fed will come back and regurgitate to members of their colony that haven't been able to feed. But they don't do that unless the bats that haven't been able to feed are basically on death's door. But they will share the food. Okay, so if we want to talk about costs, I just can't get past being a biologist at heart. We understand that any trait must increase the probability that the organism's genes are going to make it into the next generation in order to be selected for. Okay, so no matter what you're going to do to cooperate, it's all basically about getting your genes in the next generation. I talk about myself in my classes as being a genetic dead end and a big genetic zero because I don't have offspring on purpose. That is not common in the human race. Why? Because people with the bizarre behavior of myself of not having kids. Exactly, I'm not going to pass on that trait. So I did have on a test one time, why is Dr. Venneman a genetic zero? And one of my students wrote, because she has big thighs. And they are. And I wrote back on her test, well, if that meant I couldn't find a mate and that's the reason that I didn't breed, yes, that would be accurate. All right, so there's a number of different theories of cooperation, and these are the ones that I'm going to talk about: reciprocity, kin selection, byproduct of mutualism, and group selection, and all of those are different ways to explain cooperation. So the first one, reciprocity, basically is I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, and in this case, I'll pick your bugs if you pick mine. And if you look at any kind of reciprocity, you might think, well, we understand that there's a benefit to that. You like to get your bugs picked, but there's also a cost. So anytime that you're basically not paying attention to what you're doing, something can come up and get you. So there are dangerous positions to be in as an organism. Quite often those dangerous positions to be in are feeding and breeding. But even in this case, if you're totally consumed in picking your neighbor's bugs, somebody can come up to your back and eat you or kill you. This sort of keep your back covered shows up in humans too. If any of you ever go out to eat in a restaurant, you'll notice that all the booths get taken first, where you have your back covered while you're eating. Your predators can't come up and eat you. The last places to get picked are those tables out in the middle of the restaurant. You ever notice that? Okay, if you haven't noticed that the next time you go to a restaurant. Nobody wants to sit in the middle because it's a dangerous thing to be out there eating and not paying attention because the predators could get you. All right, so a number of meta-analyses, meaning that they put a whole bunch of studies together, have supported this hypothesis of reciprocity, that you groom me, I groom you. We decrease parasites this way, and if we decrease parasites, we increase health, increase the chance that you're going to survive and reproduce. But then again, the downside is decreased vigilance. So we normally call reciprocity reciprocal altruism. Altruism is just a fancy name for being helpful. And it's more likely to be favored when natural selection 3 criteria are met. And the first criteria is that animals live in groups and they're going to interact with the same partners. So in this case, a herd of horses. Herd of horses aren't very fluid. They actually interact with one another for the majority of their lifetime. And I could get on my soapbox about our wild horses and grazing rights out in the West, but I won't go there. But anyway, they're groups of animals that interact with one another over long periods of time. And the third criteria is that they have the ability to recognize those that have helped them in the past. And so the picture on your left is 2 horses doing mutual grooming. They're basically, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And horses do this on a regular basis, so they're grooming one another. And I wish I had a picture, I used to before my house burned down, but anyway, I had a really big horse and a really little horse. And the big horse would groom the little horse, and the little horse would just kind of go, couldn't reach anything. And on the right, here's an example of a horse grooming his human groom. So you can see that this particular behavior is probably not just associated with other horses, but with the grooming process itself. So I'll have people bring horses to me, and they're like, oh, my horse tries to bite me. I'm like, he's not trying to bite you. You're grooming him, he's being nice and grooming you back, except that's unacceptable behavior because, you know, I don't want to get bitten by their horse. So anybody who's in any of my classes recognize that I'm very anthropomorphic. That's the fancy word for assigning human characteristics and emotions to animals. However, I think that animals have basically human emotions and that we'll just figure it out eventually. We're a very, very arrogant species. We think we're superior to everybody else. And my brother doesn't think his dog can love him. Very unusual man. But anyway, I pointed out he probably doesn't love his wife either. She just reinforces behaviors that he exhibits towards for her, which as a society we call love. I can shut my brother down. Okay. So, on the slide here, like I say, it's like duh. So, neuroscientists have discovered that mice, they actually can recognize other mice, and that they show in their brain patterns of anxiety and distress when one of their little mice they know is harmed. So if unfortunately, you know, the rats were the evil thing along with the cats and other talk, but I like rats, they're my buddies. But anyway, mine live in captivity and don't eat birds. So anyway, they're cute and I like them. But anyway, so they actually show brain patterns that they're distressed when their little friends are being harmed. Like if I would pluck one of their little friends out of a cage and go insert an electrode into its brain, versus somebody they didn't know. And that's kind of the same thing that happens with humans too. Would you agree with that? Yeah, okay. So how do animals know one another? Well, probably a lot of the same ways that we know one another. They can actually recognize facial recognition, and there's studies in monkeys that they recognize one another, and that's part of the problems with us recognizing monkeys, is we can't tell them apart very well because we haven't been raised showing variations of monkeys to us, so we can't differentiate very well. There's research in humans, we're not very good at detecting individuals from other races. So if you haven't grown up in a multicultural environment, everybody who's from a different race might look real similar to you and you can't pick them apart very well. So there's that same facial recognition that we see in animals as we have in humans. There's also other ways that we know animals detect whether or not you're somebody else or the self. MHL, or major histocompatibility complex. So basically this is an internal mechanism inside our body that tells the difference between us and others. And you might know that that goes awry when you have autoimmune diseases like lupus. But you can detect the ability to know self from other by that particular mechanism. And humans are able to do that with recognizing other human beings. So many of the scientific experiments that I think are fun are kind of gross. But so they would take people and they would have them wear a t-shirt for a long period of time, get all sweaty and nasty in it. And then they would take that t-shirt and let other people put their nose on it to see whether the people could recognize who had worn the t-shirt. And the people, they couldn't say, oh, that's so-and-so's t-shirt, but they can go, I like that t-shirt, or I don't like that t-shirt. And it so happens that you don't like the t-shirt worn by your brother. And it's not because he doesn't know his dog loves him. But that would probably be a mechanism that I would not want to breed with my brother. Yeah? Because anybody in here from Arkansas? Because we're not in Arkansas. Okay? So you don't breed with your brother. So anyway, but they do like t-shirts that are from their mate, you know, their boyfriend or whatever. So people can actually have that ability to sniff out the difference between self and others and how closely related you are. So humans actually like to breed with people who are somewhat closely related, but not too closely related. Bees are also recognized stranger, non-stranger bees. And the same thing is true in tadpoles. If you raise a tadpole, you can either make it a vegetarian tadpole, like when I lived in California. Woo. And we didn't drive on the beach. It was a bizarre concept when I moved here, and it's like, you drive on the beach? So anyway, yes, vegetarians in California, you had a vegetarian tadpole, or if you feed them meat in early life, they can become meat-eater tadpoles. So what you find out is if you have tadpoles that are vegetarians, they like to hang around their relatives. But if you have tadpoles that were raised as meat eaters, they avoid hanging around their relatives. What's the advantage of that?
Food competition.
What's that?
Food competition.
Food competition.
They don't want to be food.
Who don't you want to eat? And don't make this nasty.
They just fight over the meat.
You want to eat your relatives.
Yeah, you don't want to eat your relatives. Yeah. And so if you're a meat eater, you don't want to hang around your relatives because you could accidentally eat your relatives. But they also found out that these tadpoles, if they got a relative in their mouth to start eating them, apparently they could smell the difference and they spit it back out. It's like, oh my God, that's my brother. Okay. The second theory of cooperation is called mutualism. And I went too fast, didn't I? Okay, mutualism. Mutualism, I should have brought my glasses. With mutualism, the organism is rewarded for cooperating and punished or penalized for not, and therefore you don't have to keep track of who your friends are, okay? And so I teach an entire course about learning where we talk about positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, penalty, and punishment, but you only have to recognize that if you do something, it's good for you, or if you do something, it's bad for you with this particular one. And in positive reinforcement, we can end up with cooperation because cooperation is going to get you something good. I wish it would. Okay, should probably just not touch it. And in this case, we have a picture of ground-feeding birds. So ground-feeding birds, like the last talked about, they're down there on the ground. They're kind of like a sitting duck for something in the air to pick them off. Would you agree? Okay. So it's kind of dangerous to ground feed. And so you can mathematically figure out whether or not you're going to be cooperative in your feeding or not. And so if there's very little food available, ground feeders will just snatch up the food and eat it themselves. But if there's a lot of food where you're going to be there for a while, then you're going to call all your friends to come feed with you. And the reason why you're going to call all your friends to come feed with you is that there's basically a penalty for that failure. And the penalty for the failure is if you're one bird feeding and the cat comes along, you probably have a 1 in 1 chance of being the target. But if you have 99 of your friends come to feed with you, you have 1 chance out of 100 to be the target to get eaten. So it seems like you might be being nice, but it's actually a byproduct of being able to survive that way. So there are some times where the benefits to the donor are very subtle, and there are some birds in Costa Rica that actually do a mating dance. 2 males will do this pretty mating dance to attract a female, but it's always the alpha male that gets to mate with her. And so they were trying to figure out what's the benefit to the other dude. You know, it's like, what does Robin get out of this? Batman's the cool guy, right? Yeah? Nobody ever even talks about Robin. But anyway, so what the DNA study showed was that although the beta male, the Robin guy, didn't get to breed those females, if he worked in conjunction with the dominant male, he was the one that was able to inherit that territory. So eventually, when Batman would retire of the bird world, Robin gets to take over, and then he gets the girls. So the third way to explain cooperation here is kin selection. Kin selection was put forward by a guy named Hamilton, and his theories on social behavior started about 50 years ago, so about the time I was born. So by the time I made it to college, this is pretty much old hat. This is the way I think about behavior and think about social behavior, probably because that was how I was introduced to that. So I handed out a handout, and if you could not share with other people, read it. It should only take you a second to read it, and follow the directions. Circle one of those things. I'm not going to humiliate you in public. No one will know what your answer is, okay? So answer truthfully. There are people digging for pens. Yes, if I texted it, everyone would get it, wouldn't they? I've been called at my university a dinosaur and a relic. I think they're hoping for extinction, but I have not gone away yet. And the poor people in my online class can recognize I'm not a computer person. All right, so fill it out. If not, you are a. So what I would like you to do is hand it to the person next to you. Now take it, hand it to the person behind you, swap with the person behind you. So everybody should still have one, because you're swapping, you're not donating. Okay, hopefully now you're confused enough about who owns what piece of paper that it is anonymous. And I would like you to look at the piece of paper that you got. And I want you to raise your hand if that person who filled out that piece of paper saved the person they didn't know. Okay, no one saved the person who didn't know. Poor guy, should never come along. All right, how many people saved the cousin? Okay, we have 2 cousins that were saved. How many people saved a brother or sister? We got more people saving a brother or sister. How many people saved yourself? Okay, so what the little illustration was about was if we talk about the rules, the more closely related you are, the greater the probability of your cooperation. And who do you love? Yourself the most. Okay? So it's not some fruity psychological thing about, ooh, love yourself. It's actually true. In terms of natural selection, you love yourself most. And so it's got to do with your survival and reproduction. So you are going to be most cooperative with those who share your genes. Because even though I did not breed, my brother and sister did. So I share some genes with them. I have genes in the next generation, and I didn't have to do any of the work. Okay. So we would talk about that being inclusive fitness. And if you understand the concept of selfish gene, then you understand inclusive fitness. And the gene is the unit of success in terms of natural selection. What I love about thinking about the selfish gene is basically organism evolved just to carry genes around. And I know that's hard to recognize, but we are only just a vesicle for the genes to get somewhere else. All right? So if you share genes with others, of course, you're going to benefit when they actually reproduce. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. So then I've got here, it's just not all love. So you might think about somebody with their offspring being just like the perfect cooperative enterprise because you share genes, right? So the baby in there, I think it's a real one and not a fake one. So if the baby's in there, it shares what percentage of the genes with the mom? Yeah, 50%. We're assuming that she just like replicate on herself, she's not playing. Okay? So, but actually there's quite a bit of competition between mothers and fetuses. And those fetuses who are selfish and don't cooperate very well with the mother are the ones that are most likely to live. So when the fetus implants inside the mother, it redirects the blood flow to itself and away from the mother. Didn't know if you know that or not. But anyway, and so if they don't do that very well, those are more likely to spontaneously abort. So what would natural selection choose for? Yeah, for the selfishness in the fetus. And they do, and it so happens that when the blood gets regulated towards the baby and not towards the mother in terms of having blood flow go to the fetus, the mother can actually have high blood pressure and die from that. In that case, that would not be chosen for. Do not kill your host. All right. Another thing would be if the baby isn't getting enough food, they can actually mess with the mother in terms of the sugar in the blood. They try to increase sugar in the blood. What does the mother do in self-defense? Try to lower the sugar in the blood. So there's this fight between trying to raise the sugar in the blood, lower the sugar in the blood, and the outcome can be gestational diabetes. Okay, another example of what is definitely genetic. You don't have to think about it because I don't think a fetus can really think about this. It's just something that's being controlled by the genes. Is grooming in rats. They discovered a gene in rats that actually controls for grooming behavior. It's not cleaning up yourself and knowing what color socks you're wearing that day. It's actually trimming the whiskers off of other rats. All right? So the gene controls grooming, but it controls grooming of other rats. And so we could get to something what we call group selection. So I'm not too huge on group selection because I think it's just like another layer you don't need. And if people in science know the concept of Occam's razor, like the most parsimonious, least complex theory is one that's right. So anyway, here's another layer though. And some biologists propose that there's a group selection process going on, and that proposes that all individuals impact others, and that natural selection then has an impact on two levels, and that's within group selection and between group selection. So within group selection is where we see herds or flocks being altruistic to one another basically because it's going to help them breed. But if you have an entire group that benefits from that, it could help the group. Within group selection is more aimed at not cooperating rather than cooperating within a group though, because you're fighting for dominance within your own particular group. But if the traits of your group help you outbreed other groups, then that trait can be chosen for. So an example back here We've got our feeders. And if you call all your neighbors over and you actually eat together and more people in your group survive than the neighboring group, then those particular genes would be chosen for. Okay, there's downsides to within group cooperation though. I think everybody recognizes this. Who is that in terms of the arachnid? It is Charlotte, okay. Charlotte built her own web, and she was kind of solitary, if you recall. But there are some... Okay, somebody thinks I'm funny. Okay, I'll go home with you. That's okay, I know his wife. All right, but there are some spiders who actually live in groups and share large communal webs. They cooperate in hunting and raising their young. A downside to that, I think like was alluded to in the last talk though, if you hang out in isolated groups, in terms of genetics, you get you much decrease your genetic variability and increase your chance for extinction. Okay, so I'm just gonna go and end here that since I'm a behaviorist, a real hardcore behaviorist, there is no such thing as nature or nurture. So everything happens together. You have nature, which is your genetic component, and then you have nurture, which is what happens in the environment. So there would be certain traits controlled by genes that would predispose you to certain behaviors. This is me and a cow, okay? My ancestors on my father's side were dairy farmers. I teach about sleep in all my classes. I love sleep. I would have been even happier to talk about sleep. But anyway, sleep, you have two kinds of people: larks, people that like to get up at the break of dawn, and owls, people who like to stay up all night. And it's kind of on a continuum, but there's larks and owls. Dairy farmers are traditionally larks. Why would they choose being a dairy farmer?
So that's when the cats speak.
Yeah, so you get up to milk the cows because you're up and it's all good, okay? As opposed to an owl would not do very well with this particular profession. So we self-selected the thing. Another thing, mountain climbing gene, they discovered what we would call a mountain climbing gene. A high percentage of people who are mountain climbers have this particular allele of a gene. And it's like, cool, we've got a mountain climbing gene. I obviously don't have it. However, if I had enough motivation, I could climb a mountain. But they found out that the mountain climbing gene actually has to do with blood pressure regulation. And so those people, it's easy for them. They don't have to work real hard. And so with that, I'll say eventually they will find a gene that has to do with loving horses. And I have the horse-loving gene, and I know that's kind of irrelevant, but do you have questions? Because I think everything comes down to level of a gene. Yes, the person in black.
I have a comment than a question. I sit in a booth because it's more comfy than a chair in the middle. Just want to say that out. I don't hear somebody beating me from behind.
I'd say that these things, unless you're very odd behavioral psychologist like myself, we probably don't know why we prefer a booth and think it's more comfy and homey.
Well, most of the chairs in the middle are wood versus the booth that are cushioned.
Okay. I bring my own cushion.
For the grooming feature in the rats, you said it's genetic, you found it in genes. So if you, the rats that do not have that gene cannot groom if they watch somebody else groom for them?
I have not read any literature that they teach one another how to groom, like certain monkeys teach one another how to wash potatoes. I've not read any observational learning of grooming in rats. But it could be out there. It could be your graduate study. Or not. Okay.
I have a question even of the studies that we do in mice, because I was sort of that psychoneuroendocrinologist. When those mice are inbred and are supposedly genetically identical, do they still recognize each other?
I don't know.
I think they should.
But I think that would go back to my reciprocity thing. It's like they probably can still recognize one another because even if you're an identical twin, you're not completely identical.
Yeah, well, that's what I was, I mean, that could be an issue of gene activation, are there some genes on that aren't on, et cetera. That just
Yeah, and I'm sure that the study that came out about crying about your friends getting hurt when they get plucked out of the cage, those were in those highly interbred rats. I always love to have questions that I can't answer. It makes me feel so good.
On your little survey that you passed out, has the choice, your offspring, your child, has that ever been one of your choices, and what was the result?
It has, but people get, okay, that goes back to nature nurture again. I wanted to kind of make it just genetic, but you had that learning component to it too, and you learn to love your offspring. One of the reasons you learn to love your offspring has to do with positive reinforcement and dopamine in your brain. So when you give birth to a baby and you're a woman, it causes you to release a lot of different chemicals in your body, which makes you let down milk. It also goes to part of your brain that increases the probability that you will be attached to this thing that just ripped you open. Okay, that's very good in terms of something that would help in terms of natural selection. Otherwise you go, oh my God, that thing just hurt me, I'm gonna leave it on the side of the road. So you have that bonding that occurs between you and your offspring, not just that genetic connection. So a lot of times if I put something in there about their offspring, they get all whacked up and say the offspring instead of themselves, and it wasn't as good an example.
And if I can ask another question, because I just Googled, I got asked the gestational diabetes question, and I was Googling that. I could not find, what I came up with Medmiss and Google Scholar was we really don't know the mechanisms of that, but your reasoning sounded good to me. I'm like, is that something
I could try to find the reference and get
That's
it for you.
okay. I mean, I'll just use it.
I didn't make it up. And I don't Google Scholar, and I was horrified at Wikipedia, I'm sorry. I don't let my students Wikipedia me.
Yeah, I know.
Kiss on a Dinosaur, a relic. If it's on a piece of paper, it means more to me. All right, any other questions?
I have a question. Regarding bats and their behaviors to bring food back to the bats.
They suck the blood out of other animals, and then they regurgitate that blood into the mouth of a bat that's starving.
Okay. Do they regulate on which bat has received blood? Or
They can-
is it just survival of the fittest like in birds in the nest?
They can keep track of their friends.
They can.
Yes. So if that rat because I think they're just rats with wings. That's all that is. Anyway, if they recognize another bat has helped them in the past, they're more likely to regurgitate for that bat. That's the reciprocity thing. And it's just also yummy. All right, and I could go on and on about the whole family thing, and it's like the worst place to be in a family is growing up with someone who's not your biological relative, because that's very dangerous. In terms of cooperation, the chances that you're going to survive are even lower if you're being raised in a family by non-biological parents. I usually talk about things like death, I'm sorry. Yeah, everything's always a downer, but that's why it takes me 3 years. Another question, yes.
Is your thesis that some of these cooperative behaviors are phylogenetic? That is, they come through the gene stream?
My hypothesis would be that yes, if they did not benefit in reproduction eventually, that they would not be chosen for.
So it's literally inherited in the gene stream?
Yes. So you could have the probability to exhibit that behavior, and it's the probability and the actual mechanism that you can exhibit that behavior that's genetic.
There's a social aspect of things like altruism. You see altruism, you're much more likely to exhibit it versus, and that's a strain in general, that's the line.
Yeah, and I think most biologists would say that that is a byproduct. Like you can have love